They advertise themselves as being cheaper by using a phony cost number. They call it the levelized cost of power. What that refers to is the average cost over the course of a year, but the power that they're providing is intermittent. And so because you need power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but you don't have wind all the time, you need to have a second power system running in the background to back it up. And they leave out the cost of that second power system. What you should do is ask for the cost of either the backup natural gas power plants that are running in the background or the battery systems that you'd need if you're going to use batteries instead. When you add those in, solar with battery backup is by far the most expensive power system out there.
Well, I have the pleasure of being joined here all the way from Canada by Professor Ross McKitrick. Ross is a professor at the University of Guelph. He is also a senior fellow at the like-minded Fraser Institute, which is also in Canada. And importantly for our purposes, he is one of the authors of the Trump administration's 23rd of July, famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, report into the state of climate change science. Ross, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Adam.
So look, let's start with this report. It was released on the 23rd of July, 131 pages. It certainly rocked the world's climate change establishment, I would say. Essentially, it argued that climate catastrophism was misplaced. Yes, there was global warming, but it's nowhere near as bad as some people think. It's based very heavily on models as opposed to what's actually happened. Natural disasters are not increasing in their prevalence. And sea levels are not rising as much as many people think. So my first question to you as one of the authors, or one of the 5 authors, I believe, a very eminent group of people, is what did you find to be the most important findings from that paper?
Well, I think you summarized some of the really key points. We looked at some of the weaknesses around attribution science, including extreme event attribution. We spent a lot of time looking at models themselves. So we go into some detail about how models, model reproductions of the climate over the past 40 years compare to what actually happened. Now, one of the points there that we emphasize is the models disagree sharply among themselves. So they differ in their estimate of climate sensitivity to greenhouse gases by a range of at least 3. And so that means the climate models themselves, you've got some on the low end that are saying you'll hardly even notice it, hardly anything is going to happen. And at the high end, you've got catastrophe. So this is after 50 years and billions of dollars of effort into modeling. And the modeling community as of today still can't really say whether this is a tiny problem or a big problem. But we can show, and we do show in the report, that model attempts to reproduce the surface temperature history since 1980. Some of the models do okay, but most of them overshoot what happened because they appear to be too sensitive to CO2. The same as in the troposphere layers. There's a lot of excess warming going on there in the models. And then they get some of the other patterns wrong that they should by now be getting right if they're really modeling the climate correctly. We then talked about extreme weather, as you alluded to, and in that section, we relied pretty heavily on the IPCC reports. We just quote them at some length, but then we just show the data. It's really self-explanatory. We looked at things like social impacts, heat deaths versus cold deaths. So there's a lot of evidence that cold weather is much more deadly than warm weather. We looked at greening, for instance. So that was a topic that we decided to cover it, and then we realized we can't really tell you what's in the IPCC reports on this because they just seem to give it a pass. It's a big topic. It affects, greening has affected every continent. CO2-induced increases in vegetation coverage. And also we talk about the effects on agriculture, that CO2 is having a fertilizing effect on global agriculture. And then on the economic side, we just reviewed the literature that shows we can't really see an impact on economic growth from warming. There have been some papers that have asserted that there is, but a larger literature has said doesn't It's just not a significant effect, doesn't seem to be there. Um, there are some negative effects, especially around extreme heat. Um, but there again, you've got um, some positives, some negatives, and things balance out to fairly small numbers. Um, so if you look 100 years from now in a model, yes, you could say 2 or 3 degrees of warming would translate into a few percent loss in real income. But you need to remember that's against a baseline growth where you've increased global per capita income 4 or 5 times over. So it's a small effect in comparison to everything else that's going on. So those, I think, were some of the key points that we made. And overall, what we wanted to do was say to people, we're not pulling this out of nowhere. This is it there in the scientific literature. If you're hearing it for the first time, the question is, why aren't the main reporting bodies that work on this, why haven't they made these things clear?
Well, just on the data versus the models, is it fair to say that all of the angst, all the concern about climate change as a destructive force basically stems from these models as opposed to what has actually happened? Is that a fair comment?
Um, yeah, I think it stems from what you might consider the upper half of the model distribution. So the lower half, the ones that track the data better, they also project less warming. The upper half, and the Canadian model would be the worst of the bunch, to be honest. It's just way off. It, if we ask the Canadian model what should have happened over the last 50 years, given how much greenhouse gases went into the air, it'll tell you way more warming than actually took place. The other side of that, though, are these scenarios that are used of future emissions. And we go into some detail about how there's a group of emission scenarios that are just unrealistic. They project way too much over the interval where we can compare them to observations. There's way too much emissions built into them. Most of the impact studies that you see are based on scenarios like RCP 8.5, which just have way more emissions in them than are realistic. And so you take a scenario like that, you plug it into one of the hot models, you'll get a really scary future forecast, but it's not credible.
You mentioned earlier the greening of the planet from extra CO2 in the atmosphere, and that really struck me as a fascinating point. I certainly had not read about that. Is it possible at all, and maybe not necessarily what the report said, but is it possible in your view that global warming of 2 or 3 degrees could even be a net benefit because of the distribution of costs and benefits across the globe?
Certainly it could. And that would still be within the range of what you find in the academic literature. I think most of the literature, if we summarize that in terms of what's called the social cost of carbon, at a global level, does CO2 pose a net cost or a net benefit? The numbers tend to come out at a fairly small amount, but there are some studies that say when we add everything up, it would be a slightly negative cost, meaning a net benefit. With regard to agriculture, we talk about some of the studies that have projected really big losses from global warming, and they've continued to come out. And typically what they do, though, is they'll have a really large negative effect associated with warming, with extra heat, but they either heavily dampen or leave out altogether the benefits from extra CO2 in the air, the fertilization benefits. But when those are both taken into account, what you get right across the global warming projections is the two cancel each other out. You end up with either no change, or for some crop types, you would get a net benefit. So yeah, we don't make the argument in the report that global warming is going to be a net benefit or CO2 isn't a net cost. What we say is, here's a distribution. You have to make certain assumptions to get an estimate that this is a big hazard or a big cost, but very reasonable assumptions would actually give you the other side, that this is not likely to be a net problem.
Just one more question on the historical record before we move on to the reaction to the report. Is it fair to say that throughout history, to the extent that we can measure temperatures, the climate and temperatures have moved fairly rapidly without obviously human involvement? I sometimes hear people talk about little ice ages or medieval warm periods, this sort of thing. Is that evidence that the climate does move in ways that we maybe don't fully understand, but certainly moves in ways that humans have not contributed to?
Um, we don't really go into the paleoclimate material in the report itself. There are definitely intervals, especially at the regional level. Anywhere you do a long-term climate reconstruction at the regional level, you'll get long departures. You mentioned the medieval warm period. That certainly shows up in a lot of areas, especially in the northern hemisphere. Um, what we do talk about, though, are some of the natural drivers of climate change, because that figures into the question of how do we attribute changes to greenhouse gases. And there's still a lot of deep unknowns, especially the behavior of the oceans and some of the
Mm.
large-scale natural drivers that we know have to be there because they did induce large climate changes in the past.
Now, just moving on to the reaction, this came out in July, and I think within days, certainly weeks, there was a near hysterical reaction, I would say, from let's say the climate policy elites who slammed your report as full of errors, biased, hundreds of false claims. We're obviously not going to go through all those. We don't have time. But were you surprised? Firstly, were you surprised by the vehemence of the response? And secondly, did any of these people make any good points in your view?
Well, to the first one, no, we weren't surprised. Now, I should say that so we worked as a small group out of the Department of Energy. We were not connected to or involved in the group at the EPA who are preparing something called the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on the endangerment finding. When we first started, we thought we might be asked to do something with them, but early on they made it clear, no, that's a team at the EPA, mostly lawyers. They're going to work on their own. So as we got closer to being done, we said, well, look, if we're not connected to the rulemaking for the endangerment finding, we'd like our report to be put out separately. We'd like it just to stand alone. We're not involved in the endangerment finding process. But they chose instead to release our report right alongside the release of the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So for a lot of observers, there was a huge amount of upset at the idea that the Trump administration may try to overturn the endangerment finding, because then that would have big regulatory implications. So because our report was released at the same time, everybody kind of assumed it was all one giant project. And I think that triggered a more intense reaction than it would have received if it had come out independently, just as a report on its own. That said, the media coverage was entirely predictable. It was, a lot of reporters who I'm sure didn't read it and wouldn't really be in a position to understand it if they did, who just slammed it, and they got quotes from all the usual suspects. The carbon brief, they contacted all the authors we cited and sort of tried to goad them into disavowing our use of their research. I think that Associated Press did the same thing. We heard from some people who contacted us to say, look, you guys used our work correctly. We have no objections to, you summarized the work correctly. But of course, their comments never appeared in these stories. All they heard was the ones who said we got it wrong. There's that big report from Carbon Brief that said over 100 errors. It's deceptive there because there were very few points where they said there was an actual error. Mostly what they said, our report was misleading, and there'd be a paragraph and they'd find someone who disagreed with something that we said, and it was more they have a different perspective on the issue, or their opinion runs in the other direction. So we don't pretend that we're saying everything that has to be said on all of these topics. We're pointing to literature that's been overlooked or downplayed in the past. The bigger review came from a group led by Andrew Dessler and Robert Kopp, two American climate scientists, and they put out like a 400-page response document. Now, I should say, we're going through everything. Like we are looking very carefully at all these responses, and especially the Dessler and Kopp one. Most of those comments, they're fairly constructive, but there are very few where they point to an actual mistake. Like they might say, we have a very brief discussion of solar reconstructions, for instance, and all we do is point out that there's a range of solar reconstructions. If you look from the 1600s to the present day, some of them say the sun hasn't changed at all. Some of them say the sun got brighter, and they have different ways of reconstructing this. Well, some of the critics don't like the fact that we mention that latter group. They think, no, those aren't credible. Sun didn't change. That's the end of the story. And for that, I just think, okay, you're entitled to that point of view. But our job here is to say what's the range of information that's out there. I can think of one point they made that was legitimate was in the discussion of agriculture. We didn't have a discussion of the effect of extreme heat on agricultural productivity, and we should have. So looking at that literature, it gets kind of complicated, but it depends on when in the growing season an extreme heat episode occurs. So you can't just say, well, if we have more heat waves, it'll be damaging for crops. It has to be a heat wave at a certain point in the growing season. And then if that's going to be the case, then we would also need to talk about the crop breeding that's going on for heat resilient crops. So that was legit. Some of them, they claimed that we made a mistake, and I've looked through the sources that they provided us very carefully, and I just disagree. We didn't make a mistake at all. In fact, the one topic, the fact that models overpredict warming over the past 50 years. So they said 3 papers that they said you should have mentioned these papers because they say the models get the pattern right. But all 3 of those papers actually say exactly what we said, which is the cool models getting it right, but there's this big tail, like the upper half of the models predict way too much warming. I could have taken the same graph out of all 3 papers and used that in our paper, in our report. So, like I say, we're very receptive, interested in getting things right if we have a chance to. But the media coverage certainly makes it sound like all these criticisms just wiped us out completely, and that's not the case. I think if we are able to take all the criticisms on board and rewrite things, make whatever changes are necessary, the conclusions are going to be pretty much the same, and if anything, the arguments will be stronger.
And roughly, what's the timeline on that reissuance, if you like, or second version that takes into account?
Well, that gets complicated. This being the United States, there was a lawsuit filed. Some environmental activists sued the Department of Energy, and there's a piece of legislation called the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which sets out how advisory committees are supposed to be assembled. Now, we didn't really think of ourselves as an advisory committee, but anyway, the court decided, yeah, you guys should have been set up under the terms of the FACA, as it's called. Because we weren't, the group had to be dissolved. So we have been formally dissolved. And that means we cannot actually produce another work product. So I've been going through, I know the other team members have been looking at the responses, and pretty early on we realized, okay, we'd like to take another crack at this and let people know that our work holds up, and engage in a constructive debate with the critics. But at this point, the word is no. The group has been dissolved. It might be possible at some point in the future for us to put out response material, but it's not clear at this point how that could happen because of the lawsuit.
But the secretary, my understanding, the Trump administration was very happy with your work. They praised it greatly in when they disbanded the committee. Is that right?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
they're very happy with it, and yeah, we got a lot of good comments from people privately, um, and publicly. I mean, there's some response, of course, is polarized, so certain
Mm.
predictable responses from predictable groups. But uh, no, I think they were pleased with the work product, and found it. Uh, they had wanted to trigger debate and discussion and kind of just break up the monopoly on the discussion.
Mm. Mm.
I think they they weren't pleased about the lawsuit and the
Mm.
constraints that that's put
Yes.
on us, but that's up to the court.
Yeah, just in terms of the politics of climate change, science and policy, you mentioned public and private there. I mean, the man on the street who just reads the news would have the impression that, you know, it's just you five, basically, who
Mm.
disagree with the so-called consensus, the so-called science is settled. But in private, in reality, I mean, is it, well, I mean, it's obviously not settled because you disagree, and that's enough. As I think Einstein once said, you only need one person to prove the consensus is wrong. But I mean, how settled is it? Or I mean, how much debate is there privately amongst academics that you talk to kind of around the world? I mean, I imagine there's a lot greater willingness to speak up in private as opposed to in public.
Yeah, well, for example, the range of models. Like if you ask the simplest question of all, it's not really simple, but the most basic question, how much warming would you get from doubling CO2 in the atmosphere? And at the low end, you've got a model that says you get about 1.8 degrees of warming. That's it. At the high end, you'd have a model that says 5.7 degrees of warming. Okay, so that's a threefold range within the models the IPCC uses. So we're not in a position to say the first group is right, the second group's wrong, although we think that. But we can at least say to the man in the street, okay, we're not the modelers. Like we're telling you that there's
Mm.
this much uncertainty, this huge range, and they don't even understand why the models do what they do, let alone what the climate itself does. Um,
Mm.
but the man in the street should understand, um, among climate scientists themselves, they are in wide disagreement about this issue and whether it's a big deal or not. What we can do, though, is show you which of the models did a good job at reproducing the last 50 years, because that's a good indicator of which of the models are more likely to be right about the next 50 years.
Just in terms of all these models, you were saying the top half of the distribution is particularly alarmist, if you like, or you know, leads to catastrophic conclusions. I mean, I'm kind of asking you to get in the minds of other academics a bit, but do you think politics comes into this a bit? I mean, is there a correlation between, you know, people's political views as to how big the state should be, how intrusive the state should be, and oh, look, they just tend to produce the models that actually, you know, require the greatest intervention? I mean, is that too cheeky to suggest that correlation?
I think so. I mean, I suppose you could try graphing the equilibrium climate sensitivity of the models and then the political makeup of the jurisdiction where the model came from, but I don't actually think they'd be all that well correlated. Um, it's even well, within the United States, for instance, there's a whole bunch of models and they differ among themselves. It, there's some, like I mentioned, the Canadian model, and it's just persistently off the charts, and it's broadly discussed in the climate literature that okay, the Canadian model is the atmosphere warms 7 times too fast in the Canadian model compared to observations. I think the bigger question is why don't they either fix it or just shut it down? Like,
Hmm.
why spend all this money running a model that's so unreliable? I guess they have their reasons why they think it's still useful having a model like that, but
Yes.
uh,
Just, I mean,
to me, that's the bigger question. Why even bother running it?
just putting my question a different way, I mean, cynics or critics, including myself, see the climate change as kind of an industry. It's this huge industry now, and of course, if you produce research that says it's not important, then you're kind of putting yourself out of a job. I mean, is that kind of part of the explanation of why you do get so much hysteria from the climate change industry itself? Is because they need to justify their existence and funding from governments and organisations, etc. And of course, they may also have an ideology which prefers a bigger and more intrusive government, taxes, regulations, etc., which you need to have if you're going to reduce emissions, etc.
Well, one point I would make is that yes, in the past, the scientists have stood up and said, I've looked at this pretty carefully, and I just don't think this is a big problem. Things don't go well for them. I mean, one of our team members, Judith Curry, basically got drummed out of her university for that. Another one, Roger Pielke Jr., who wasn't on our group, but he was just a mainstream scientist working in extreme weather, and he made the point, I guess, once too often and got drummed out of his university. You only need a couple of people to go through that, and then others see it, and you just won't hear from them. So that is a real issue, and it's a real problem in this field. I mean, I'm in economics where we deal with policy disputes all the time. You got economists famously, can't agree on anything. It's different in the climate field. There's just a much more of a sense you have to hew the orthodoxy, and I've found that all these years working on topics closely related to climate science, that it's different in economics. There's much higher tolerance for debate and dissent and heterodoxy.
Yes.
And then with some of the areas, though, lately they really have got into openly declaring their intentions. So one topic is extreme weather attribution, and there are people working in that field who just put it right in their papers that our findings would be good for supporting liability lawsuits, and our findings have immediate policy implications and could be used in court cases. And I think that's very inappropriate for that. It just sounds like they had their eye on that kind of outcome when they sat down to do the analysis, and it feeds back into the study design and the way they phrase their conclusions.
Just moving on now strictly to the economic side of things, my understanding as kind of an outsider looking in was that when Nordhaus and other economists were looking at this in the first decade, say, of this century, that the general view amongst economists was, as you kind of pointed out earlier, was that climate change is a problem, but it's actually not that big a problem. But my understanding since then is that the social cost of carbon, which I think is required to estimate to draw conclusions about the cost in the future, this has been increased dramatically by economists, by others. I think in one of your recent papers, you said Biden administration increased it 4 or 5 times, which obviously makes it much more of a pressing problem. So my question is, why has this social cost of carbon? Actually, firstly, what is the social cost of carbon, briefly, and why has it been increasing so rapidly over the past 15 years or so?
The social cost of carbon, it's a money measure. It's meant to indicate if you think of a ton of CO2 being released from fossil fuel consumption, and then you trace through over the next 300 years what that CO2 will do to the climate, and then what those climate changes will do to people, agriculture, health, everything around the world, and you add that all up and discount it back to the present, then you should be able to get a number, and it might be $50 per ton of emissions or something like that. But that's meant to represent the social cost of your emissions. And so, yes, those numbers, when they first began, there was a few different models that scientists and economists used, trying to add up all the damages. The numbers came out fairly low. And so you mentioned William Nordhaus. He was the first to come up with what's called an integrated assessment model for trying to calculate these things. And in the 90s, the people who worked on this in economics generally thought, as you said, it's going to be a problem, but not all that big a problem. And for the most part, we'll just have to get used to it. just learn to adapt to it, but don't try to stop it, because you can't stop CO2 emissions without stopping fossil fuel use, and that's just way too costly for the world economy. And more recently, the adaptations that have been made to these models tend to be very speculative. Like they'll put in a module for what's called mortality damages. So how many people will be killed by an increase in average temperatures of a degree? Well, uh, it at that point it really just becomes a tautology. If you write down a high damage mortality function, you get a high social cost of carbon number. How good is your damage function? They're not very good. They're very noisy. They don't have a lot of data behind them. Same with the agricultural damages. Now those have a lot more data behind them, but um, as I mentioned, if they leave out the CO2 fertilization, they can tell you that agricultural damages will be huge, and that means add another $50 a ton to your social cost of carbon number. Um, so what I've noticed in the past decade or so, it's sort of seemed like um, there was a race on to be the first person who would publish a paper that says the social cost of carbon is $100 and then $200, and then I'll see if you're 200 and raise you to 300. Like, find a reason. You can do it. The models are big enough and they have enough loose parameters in them.
Mm.
The question would always be, how valid are the assumptions that you need to get these high social cost numbers? And that's where knowing this field in some detail, I would say the big increases are just not well motivated on the underlying evidence, and you have to ignore a lot of stuff to get those kinds of numbers.
And and separately from the Trump report that you helped write, the Department of Energy report, you've also done some work on crop yields recently, and I believe you looked at a report which was quite catastrophic in its conclusions, and you've expanded the data set, and it's actually nowhere near as catastrophic when you do that. Could you just run us through what the conclusions of that were, and also why that paper was important?
So it was a 2017 paper that appeared in one of the Nature journals that said they've looked at all the newest science, and it implies the social cost of carbon should be much higher because there'll be massive global damages to crop yields. And the Biden administration cited it. That was one of the reasons it boosted the social cost of carbon estimate as much as it did. And then that in turn triggers new regulations and charges and so on. When I looked at that paper, the first thing I noticed was that they had just reused the data set from a 2014 study that I was familiar with. The 2014 study, though, had come to different conclusions. It had said the usual thing, which is, yes, the increased temperatures will pose some damages for agriculture, but the increased CO2 will more than offset it. So I wanted to figure out why these two studies used the same data but came to different conclusions. In the end, what really mattered was that the underlying data set, it was missing half of the CO2 change numbers. So they were only looking at the heat numbers, but they weren't, for half the data set, they didn't have any CO2 change estimates. So, and it was a meta-analysis, which means they didn't do the research themselves. They were surveying dozens and dozens of papers from others that had done the simulation or the data gathering. So I went back to those papers and found that actually you could get the CO2 change. You had to dig a bit in those papers, but so I added as many of the CO2 numbers as I could get, and then I just reran the 2017 analysis and found that instead of projecting huge losses to agriculture, now you get back to this previous result, which is the CO2 fertilization effects fully offset the temperature changes, and you get gains in yields around the world. Even as much as 5 degrees of warming, you still get crop yield gains. So yeah, we discussed that a bit in the report, but yeah, I published that last spring and got it in, again, one of the Nature portfolio journals. And I sent it to the authors of the 2017 paper and said, look, I think you're you've just missed a lot of
I'm
data.
sure, I'm sure they're very happy to receive that email.
Yeah.
And that study I did not see on the front page of the paper, funnily enough.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that's, the earlier paper will get headline coverage around the
Mm,
world. Lots of examples of this headline coverage around the world if it's a paper about climate related disaster. And then if 6 months later someone else comes along and says, no, you left out half your data and your results are wrong, there'll be
mm.
silence on that. It'll
Well, just coming to
sneak
mind,
its,
wasn't there I think there was a retraction, wasn't there, just recently? I read
yeah,
something in the Wall Street Journal. There was some paper that was again quite significant in saying, everything was going to be terrible,
yeah,
was withdrawn for some data reason. Do you know the specifics of that at all, or what the
yeah.
paper was?
Yeah, and ironically, so we hadn't relied on that paper, but some of the criticisms was, hey, how come you didn't rely on this COTS et al. Paper? And I was like, well, you just wait, because I knew there was trouble brewing for that paper. That was a paper that had made a ridiculous claim that by 2050, the world's economy would shrink by about a third due to climate change. And
In
um,
absolute terms, just shrink by a third.
yeah,
Okay,
and
wow.
it was a pretty crazy set of results, and people didn't believe it. But a few people went and looked at the underlying data and found that a lot of that result was driven by outliers associated with some really crazy numbers in the Uzbekistan GDP. And you take that out, and the results fall apart. And then they hadn't calculated their uncertainty bands correctly, and there are other problems. And so the paper ended up being completely wrong. But not only did it get global coverage, media coverage, but an international banking organization, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which was set up by our current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, used that paper to impose new rules on banks around the world on how they're supposed to stress test against climate
Wow.
risks. So, um, without doing any due diligence on that paper, this group of green bankers took that study and started writing new regulations to affect the banking sector. Um, and that was one of the things that people outside the field were kind of alarmed at these regulations, and that prompted some people to begin looking at the paper. Um, that organization hasn't yet retracted those rules. They're trying to tough it
Interesting.
out and say that
Interesting.
um, okay, you might want to be aware that this paper's been retracted, but it's a good illustration of the problem in this field that if actually another one we talk about this is the ocean acidification issue and coral reefs and things like that. And scientists themselves have said, and we quote some of them, that look, in this field, if you show a big negative effect, you'll get your paper will published
Mm.
and you'll get lots of media attention. And then a little while later, somebody comes along and shows that that's not true. The analysis isn't valid.
Mm.
And, but there's no corresponding media treatment of the retractions.
Yes. Now you mentioned 2050, and that reminded me of the great quest for net zero that so many governments apparently are pursuing, including the Australian government, very obsessively, in my view. I mean, I wanted to ask you, what do you make of, I guess, the likelihood and also the cost of this attempt by Western governments like Canada, like Australia, to essentially remove fossil fuels from their economies? I mean, A, is it going to happen? And B, what's the cost?
It's a really bizarre thing. They publish these commitments that by 2050 we will have gotten rid of fossil fuels. I mean, they might as well say by 2050 we'll also all be 20 pounds lighter and 2 feet taller. Like, okay, what's the plan to get there? Um,
Yeah.
we even 2030, our government is dead set committed to meeting this 2030 target, and everyone inside and outside government can tell them it'll never happen. Like you're not on the trajectory to get there. It's only a few years away. Like, why do you keep saying you're going to do this, and yet um, they won't change their goals. With 2050, I think uh, it follows a pattern of setting a target that's so far out there that none of the current politicians will be
Mm.
around to have to answer for the failure. But In the meantime, though, they are going to impose a lot of really bad policies that are very
Mm,
expensive and aren't they're not going to achieve the target, but also just on a cost benefit analysis point of view, you can show over and over these, even if we take the mainstream social cost of carbon numbers at face value, it doesn't justify the policies that
mm.
they're putting in
Incredible.
place. Um, and they'll do a lot of damage in the process. And I also think because it's such a global thing, there's a geopolitical side to it, which is countries like Russia and China and India, they're not going along with this. And so you've got the net zero countries are kind of vacating the whole space of economic growth and development and allowing Russia and China to move into continents like Africa and South America, and because they're the only ones that will help these countries develop now. They're the only ones that'll fund
Yes.
the power grid that they need. And so you're letting some hostile countries gain a lot of geopolitical influence because we're too busy
Mm,
pursuing this ridiculous goal that we know we can't
mm.
achieve.
There's a perception in Australia that the new Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada is backing away a little from some of the more extreme emissions targets or net zero policies. Is that true?
He is. He's kind of crafty about it, I guess you could say. So one of the first things he did was he canceled the consumer carbon tax, and in fact, that was the first thing he did, and it had become very unpopular. It wasn't even all that high by the standards of climate advocates, but he canceled it. Um, he put the EV mandate on hold. He hasn't canceled it outright, but he's put it on hold. And then he's just signed an agreement with the province of Alberta. So he's rescinded what was called the Clean Electricity Plan, um, that would have required Alberta to phase out fossil fuels from its electricity grid, I think by 2035. So he's removed that. He's also going to let Alberta export electricity to surrounding provinces. So I think they could actually start building out their natural gas power plants. Um, he is supportive of coastal liquefied natural gas facilities. We only have one in Canada, but he wants more to be built. He is playing a bit of an ambiguous game on whether we get a pipeline to the coast, because Alberta doesn't really have a pipeline to the Pacific Ocean to export oil through. There's one, but it's not a very large capacity pipeline. Um, this agreement with Alberta sort of supports it, although it's a bit unclear whether he would actually approve it if the proposal ever came up. But to the point, um, given the fact that he was the UN climate czar and
Mm.
the founder of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, he spent 10 years basically as the Al Gore of the finance world. And now that he's prime minister of an oil exporting country, he's he doesn't want to talk about that anymore.
Yes.
He's basically
Exactly.
pushing ahead with fossil fuel development. I think it's a good indicator of just how unrealistic so much of that rhetoric is, and
Mm,
it's put about by people who don't have skin in the game and don't really understand the issues. But as soon as someone sits them down and explains
mm,
this is the reality, um, yeah, all their convictions kind of go out the window.
mm. Well, the Australian government's certainly pressing on. They haven't seen any even glimmer of light yet, as it seems Canada is. I just wanted to get you to weigh in, just a second last question, if you could weigh in on this renewables are cheaper or not debate. In Australia, it's a constant debate between solar and wind advocates and more traditional people who say we need to stick with fossil fuels and coal and gas, etc., or nuclear. I mean, how do you answer that question when kind of the interested layperson says, isn't solar and wind cheaper because of the marginal cost is zero?
Well, I think there are three ways to answer that question at the man in the street level. The first is if they're really cheaper, then why do they need to be subsidized so much? Why is it that as soon as the subsidies end, those industries collapse? Um, the second is they advertise themselves as being cheaper by using a phony cost number. They call it the levelized cost of power. what that refers to is the average cost over the course of a year, but the power that they're providing is intermittent. And so if you're relying on solar or wind, when the sun is free, the wind is free, that's true, but the wind isn't always blowing. And so because you need power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but you don't have wind all the time, you need to have a second power system running in the background to back it up. And they leave out the cost of that second power system. So they're only telling you the cost of their power system when it's running. What you should do is ask for the cost of either the backup natural gas power plants that are running in the background or the battery systems that you'd need if you're going to use batteries instead. Now, people have added those in. When you add those in, solar with battery backup is by far the most expensive power system out there. Nothing else even comes close. So it's no possible way you could run the Australian economy on that. Even with all your sunshine, you couldn't do it. And then the third issue is, okay, if you really believe that, there's so many cities in a country like Australia, there's so many cities that have said we're all in on renewables, we want renewables. Just pick one of them and say you're going to be the test case. You tell us when you start, but we want you to run entirely on renewables. The rest of us will just sit back and watch. In fact, we'll pay for all your renewables. We'll give you all the solar power, all the wind, but the rule is that's the only system you can use. And you tell us if you're willing to be the experiment for the rest of us to watch. There might even be a city that would be dumb enough to try it, but it would last for a week at the most, and then they'd be begging for natural gas or coal to bail them out.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's a phony cost estimate. They're still subsidy dependent, and nobody's actually willing to run on renewables as their main power source.
Now, just final question. It seems that at least the Canadian government, some other governments are losing interest in the more extreme emissions policies. But I think amongst the general public, if you ask people, the perception still is that the climate's changing in devastating ways and we have to do something about it. I mean, is there any point in future years where you think more people will start to think, hang on, we keep getting these predictions and they don't come true? And, people of my generation and a younger generation won't so readily believe the hysterical newspaper stories.
I don't see a lot of surveys on this, but sometimes they cross my desk. The one I saw most recently was from Sweden, which of course is where Greta Thunberg is from. And their interest in climate change among the young people in Sweden has crashed through the floorboards. It's the lowest interest topic that they've got on their plates, and despite all the propaganda. And I think that's generally the case, that the people who are still really into the whole climate thing tend to be the older baby boomer types, the people that still watch the nightly news, basically, and or still, some of them even still get newspapers delivered to their house. But that crowd is still into all of this. But no, I think younger people, just in terms of where they get their news media and so on, but also the questions they're willing to ask, they went to school hearing over and over that we're on the verge of a crisis. And at a certain point, if you keep telling people that we're on the verge of a crisis, we're on the verge of a crisis, and then nothing really changes except their power bills go up, then they clue in that, okay, this has been oversold and I'm not really interested in hearing this anymore. I like to think also that some of it has to do with the underlying substance, that people do get educated as they go and look for the information themselves. That they find that the kinds of points that we made in our report, that, okay, this is a very unclear story. The models are all over the place. There's a pattern of exaggeration here. Some of it, though, certainly here in Canada and the US, the AI boom has caused a lot of business people to rethink this, because they're looking at the power needs over the next decade. And I think that figured into Bill Gates changing his mind on this. He just had to realize, okay, we actually need a lot of power. That means we're going to need to be using fossil fuels for a long time to come. What do we really know about climate change? And But the need to build out reliable power systems for AI and other industrial applications is a reality check for people.
All right, well, that's a very optimistic note, I think, to end on, Ross. Thank you so much for your insights and your knowledge. We're very grateful, and we'll keep in touch. And
Okay.
yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for joining the IPA.
Thanks, Adam. My pleasure.